Good morning, everyone. How are y'all doing? Good morning. Well, we would like to welcome all of you to the NAAEE Research Symposium for 2016, and we're very, very glad that you've been able to come from all over the world to come and join us today. And Nicole Arduin is my co-chair, and I'm Ruth Kermish-Allen, the chair of the Research Symposium, and we've worked really hard to develop an exciting program for you, and we hope that you all have a great time. So thank you so much, Nicole, for your help.
My pleasure.
Okay. So why are we here today? We are here to try to refill our engines, try to make sure that we're finding that inspiration amongst our colleagues to really keep going, to keep asking ourselves those really core questions that are important to our field. If you look across the room, I would say that our group of colleagues here are probably some of the most interdisciplinary researchers you would ever find at a research symposium or at a conference at all. All of us have come from very different places to this area of inquiry that we share. Many of us have come from environmental studies, sciences, policy. If you ask around the room how people got to becoming an environmental educator, I think you'll be really surprised by those answers. And so I just wanted to empower each of you today to really make sure, and over the next 2 days, ask each other those questions. What really interested you in wanting to look at these questions of the environment and how humans and animals and all of those systems interact to create the situations that we have today? If you look at not only where we are coming from, but also the areas of inquiry that we focus on, they're extremely interdisciplinary. Some of us are focusing in on schools, trying to partner with teachers and students and administrators and parents to help students as they're young have those exact experiences in environmental actions and policy that are going to help them become informed and really excited to make those informed decisions when they're adults, to give them that power and that practice in action. Many of us are also working in informal science settings where we're working with museums and zoos and aquariums, and oftentimes those participants that are visiting those places only get access to nature through that one venue. So we have to ask ourselves, what are those appropriate introductory experiences or deeper experiences to increase environmental stewardship and their connection to nature and animals? We've also got folks that are focusing in on higher ed. What are those systems? How can higher educational institutions serve as the models for what sustainability can look like? How do higher educational organizations partner with their communities and their states to become a beacon of what is really possible and what sustainability can look like? And many of us are also in policy. So the range is really vast and really exciting. But we have also the potential of becoming stagnant. So I really, again, want to empower every single one of you to be critical but kind to each other. Ask the questions about how can we methodologically really push the questions that we have? How do we get the best data to really showcase that it's not just a story, but it's real good information and research behind what can prove these particular best practices? So with that, I would like to welcome you to the 2016 Research Symposium. We're going to be having a lot of fun over the next couple of days. You'll notice that there are a few changes in our program. We're trying to shift things just slightly, but I want to put a little bug in your ear as well. Think about if you could change the Research Symposium to think about how do we get the most value out of the time that we have together? Because if you look around the room again, we have amazing power and intelligence and I guess magnificence, honestly, around this room. We are a powerhouse in this room. If we've kind of talked about the communities that people are working with, small towns and villages, cities, the reach that we have is probably one of the broadest impacts that we can have. And many of our own colleagues in other disciplines are coming to us asking, hey, how do I figure out how to broaden my impact? How do you actually partner with community organizations? How do you build trust within those new villages or communities that I haven't been able to really work with or figure out how to access yet? So think about what we can look like if we keep asking those questions, and also how could we get the best use of our time thinking about products and ideas for what we would really want to walk away from our really meaningful time together. So with that, have fun, have a great time, and I would like to hand it over to to Nicole to introduce Judy.
Thank you, Ruth. And we'll have a moment at the end as well to thank Ruth again. But I just want to say that this woman is totally incredible. She not only has finished her dissertation and her PhD in the past year, which is amazing. Congratulations. She also runs a nonprofit organization, incredibly successfully, does a ton of research, and has 2 small children, and has put together this amazing program for us. So thank you, Ruth. You are really incredible. And I'm really excited to spend the next couple of days with so many of my favorite colleagues. So thank you all for traveling from near and far to be with us for the next 2 days. I am also really honored to introduce one of my favorite colleagues, Judy Brous, with whom I've had the pleasure of working for many years. When I first had the opportunity to work with her at World Wildlife Fund a number of years ago, and I told some colleagues I was going to work with her, they said, "You're going to work with the queen of environmental education," which is absolutely true. Thank you, Judy, and your team for putting together this incredible conference for us, and thanks for being with us this morning. So welcome, Judy Brous.
Hi, everyone. It's so good to see all your smiling faces, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the NAAEE Board of Directors and our staff. We're so thrilled to have all of you guys here. And those of you who know me know that I love research and I love asking questions. So I wish I could be here the whole time. I'm going to pop in as much as I can. But it's really exciting to have more than 180 participants at the Research Symposium. And I especially want to welcome our Jeep delegates. Could you all raise your hand, say hello? Yay, let's give them a round of applause. And if you don't know what the Jeep is, you will by the end of this conference, but it's the Global Environmental Education Partnership, and we had a great meeting yesterday with 19 countries represented. It was fantastic. Yay. And I also want to thank Ruth and Nicole, 2 of my favorite people. You couldn't have 2 better people putting this together. It's going to be an amazing event, and I really look forward to hearing what comes out of it. And I can't wait to hear the keynote panel here, so that'll be fantastic. In the short time I had, I just wanted to mention a couple of initiatives related to research and evaluation that we're doing at NAAEE, and we're doing in conjunction with all of you here. And the first is EE Pro. How many of you are members of EE Pro? This is great. Oh my gosh, I love it, but there were some hands that didn't come up, so we need to talk to you. EE Pro is our online learning site, easy to sign up, it's free. All you need to do is go online and you fill out a profile, and you can take part in any discussion. But I really encourage you to take part in the Research and Evaluation EE Pro group led by Nicole Ardwin and Alan Reed, who I see in the back, where we're trying to promote discussion, blogs, interesting questions, resources, really learning what's going on so you can leave here and stay engaged with all your colleagues, which will be fantastic. And then I wanted to mention another initiative. This is the first time we've used this logo in public. So we used to be calling this Anecdotes to Evidence, but we changed it to EE Works as the main name so that it fits with EE Pro and some other things. But this initiative is something we've been working on for a while to help talk about how do we demonstrate the value and impact of the field that we work in. So many people want to help in making the case. So we often just say, well, we know it works. In our gut, we know this works. And all of you know we need a little bit more evidence to say that. So we've been working with Nicole and Stanford and a number of other amazing partners to try and look at what does the peer-reviewed research and some of the gray literature say about what works in environmental education. So there's a research part, there's gathering the stories, there's communication tools and professional development, all helping us talk about what actually works and what backs up that. So we've been doing a lot of work. We've had a lot of discussions on what the difference between peer-reviewed, gray, how to use it, how to think about it, all of that. I can talk more about this later. But we're doing it by themes. And the first one is going to be launched live on K through 12 on our website, so you'll be able to see it on EE Pro, looking at how environmental education leads to K through 12 outcomes. And Nicole can probably talk more about this later. So check out the website. We'd love your feedback. We'll be doing the other themes as they come up. But all of this in the interest of really helping to provide the tools to all of us to talk about how we can demonstrate that the work we do is important and it makes a huge difference, and that we all can better sell what we do. We know it's important. We need more funding to do the work that we do. We need more funding for research. How can we get that? And then it would be great to talk about, and maybe you'll be talking about this, how we can roll up our data in ways that will make it easier for us to talk about our collective impact, something that a lot of us have talked about. So I also love that all of you are trying to help make research more accessible to practitioners. So we don't have research over here and everyone on the ground over here working. You're actually working together and doing things together, and practitioners are doing research. And the last thing I just wanted to mention is that we are looking at developing a research database. We have the little tiny start of one on EE Pro. We're hoping that we'll be able to get some additional funding. I mean, how many of us in this room aren't saying, I really hope to get a grant? But we really do hope to get a grant that will help fund the research database, and we'll be talking to a lot of you about how we can make the research even more accessible. And also, it's great to look out and see a lot of young faces in terms of building the next generation of researchers. Really excited about that. I see a lot of, not old faces, older faces, and a lot of young faces out there. So thank you all for all you do. Thanks to, again, Ruth and Nicole for putting this together. So fantastic. And please let me know if you have any feedback on the research symposium, the conference in general, anything about NAAEE. We are here to listen to what you have to say, because we're here to help serve you, to make you be able to do your jobs better. So have a great symposium, and thank you so much. Bye.
Great, thank you so much for welcoming us. And you will all become very, very familiar with EE Pro, because it's actually embedded into a lot of our activities, both today and also tomorrow. So if you haven't signed up for EE Pro, don't do it right now, but certainly do it at some point today so you can watch the living conversation, an evolving conversation that starts right here and right now. So we are lucky enough to have a keynote plenary, a panel today, coming from a whole variety of different areas of inquiry and types of inquiry. So I'm just going to provide a little bit of structure for how we're going to run this plenary. On your tables, you have little slips that say, ask your question. They're probably turned face down right now. But we're not going to have an official time for Q&A with each of the panelists, so this will serve as a way for you to ask some questions that come up, address it to your particular panelist, and put your question down. And then as we transition between speakers, just raise your hand up in the air, and we have an amazing team of helpers here today to come and collect all of those. And then we're going to put those into themes and put those themes of the questions to our panelists up on EE Pro. So you'll be able to watch that conversation evolve in the discussion space. So they'll be helping to get in there and answer those questions, and also all of you can get in there and answer those questions. Another structural piece of our keynote plenary today is we've asked each of our esteemed colleagues to speak for 10 minutes, and they're going to be cut off rather harshly at 10 minutes because we're trying to stick very closely to time. But at the end, we're going to have some interactive time where they have put out 4 key questions to us as a research community. And I would like each of your tables to pick one of those questions when we get there, and we'll have a summary of your table's discussions on your big sticky notes, or actually they're not sticky, but you get what I mean, on your table, and we will put them out in the back so we can actually watch that, again, that conversation evolve, but with pen and paper, back with the posters throughout the session. So we'll group them by question, and you can add your own insights to those conversations of the tables. So I'll reiterate that later. It's a little confusing, but with no more further ado, I just wanted to thank so much Paul Hart for pulling this magnificent panel together and for helping me lead all of this idea.
Pleasure. Well, they haven't given me a microphone on this side of the 5 degrees of separation that I have from the rest of the panel members, so I guess I'll stand. I have 10 minutes, starting now. All right, so the panel focus that we've negotiated and decided on is crossing boundaries, the makings of high-quality environmental education research. And so Ruth and Nicole's original title was something like Towards Environmental Ed Research in 2030, Addressing Tomorrow's Wicked Questions. Ruth didn't say the wicked in her this morning. Within our Crossing Borders mandate to consider issues of quality amidst increasing diversity in social and educational research. And I know that this panel will provoke discussion of those difficult and wicked questions because our research fields across social and environmental education research have changed, and for good reason. Some of the signs and symbols of change are obvious in the proliferation and diversification of social and educational journals and books. Over 300 journals now focus on qualitative research. For example, we have special issues of qualitative inquiry focused on problematizing methodological simplicity, and post-qualitative research in the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education. As Kate McCoy has said, what is at stake is more than just knowledge, the knowledge we make as researchers, but the worlds, and I would say worldviews we make, the kinds of people we want to be, and the kinds of work we want to do in and for the world. In the end piece of the then popular 1975 compendium, What Makes Environmental Education, Wright and McInnes state that the greatest obstacle environmental educators face is a dominant worldview that programs people to see themselves as distinct from rather than distinct within the dynamics of natural processes. Thus, the promise of EE lies in facilitating the emergence of a more inclusive, more than human worldview. While John Phene in 1993 articulated worldview distinctions between a new environmental paradigm and the dominant social paradigm, Ian Rowbottom and I at the time engaged debate across different discourses of inquiry with the potential to catalyze socio-political change. Fast forward, and we now see social dimensions of learning and arrays of new qualitative research methodologies and methods more directly related to reconceptualizing people's consciousness of worldview. Within the last 30 years or so, we've witnessed constructivist, critical, post-structural, and more recently new materialist turns that have challenged the status quo of both quantitative and qualitative research, as well as hierarchies of conventional interpretation and representation, and taken for granted ideas of analysis and data that regulate how we do fieldwork and engage methods. Each new theoretical perspective works within, against, and beyond those prior theories and practices so that issues of what counts as quality now depart from statistical concepts of validity and reliability that supported the once then dominant way of knowing. We now accept that there are in fact multiple ways of knowing, and that each requires different criteria or at least different ways of viewing what can count as quality, which is itself a contested term. For example, Dr. Norman Doidge, a psychiatrist and psychotherapist, in the book The Brain's Way of Healing, has recently discussed complexity theory in medicine. And on ABC Australia's health report, his research has focused on helping people to cope with everyday life, particularly those who suffer from many conditions that may best be described as both physical conditions, that is, chronic pain syndrome, and as social issues, such as autism and learning disorders. These conditions implicate complexities of daily living, as do many educational issues. And he suggests that randomized control trials form a necessary part of the physical dimensions of these conditions, but that in themselves they are not sufficient in addressing associated social issues. The upshot is that healthcare professionals also require more detailed, close, personal research that explores their lived experiences. So he and many other healthcare professionals are now recommending qualitative studies as well as quantitative ones. What has been somewhat pejoratively called anecdotal evidence and case studies are now viewed as crucial for helping people address the complexities of their conditions in everyday coping with social living. Complexity theory, which is part of a suite of social material approaches that include CHAT and ANT, that's cultural historical activity theory, and actor network theory, suggest integration of multiple methodologies and methods that can help address both physical and social human issues, thus combining realist-based evidence with social theory and evidence from qualitative accounts of lived experience. New materialists in social science fields are moving toward these blendings of methodological perspectives that cross over the quant-qual binary. This is what Elizabeth St. Pierre and others, such as Tara Fenwick, are describing within social material approaches, and that's what they're writing about in post-qualitative research, where useful data comes from both sides of the old divide in a search for new solutions to complex physical, social problems, including environmental issues, without the stigma that either quantitative or qualitative is superior or inferior. Of course, what counts as quality is different across these different ways of knowing, and what really matters is how useful the research is in addressing complex human, non-human problems that are necessarily social and material, and that is what counts in quality in these cases. So we must enter a political zone where what we mean by the concept of quality and whether we actually need to reach consensus on what should count as quality, or to change what has been the discourse of quality across modernist, postmodernist, critical, and now new materialist lenses. Ideas of judgment, of trust, perhaps objectivity, and measures of impartial uniformity continue to count for what quant-based research, but not qual-based research, which is itself epistemologically diverse and demands different ways of assessing value, as argued by many theorists these days. So the problem is and has been that human life is somewhat messy, and so we need inquiries that can engage that social messiness. We live with uncertainties in many situations where there are no simple or certain answers, where complex questions need addressing, and where facts cannot be separated from human values. What if this map cannot represent the complexities of the territory? As social and educational research has evolved, ideas of what can count has become contested within different thinking about how to assess what may be more appropriate in different circumstances. So what if we can count, or if what we can count as quality depends on what a community of scholars, for example AERA, agrees can count as legitimate research and as evidence? What if that community of scholars is changing? What if social and educational research are fundamentally different from research in the physical sciences? What if the kinds of research we do is governed by the kinds of questions that need addressing in the everyday lives of educators, and not simply what policymakers think we need? As Rowe and Greenoff in 2014 state, the ontological turn within social science that employs different bodies of theoretical work to look creatively at how we come to know emphasizes how knowledge of the world is produced as much through habitual practices and embodied encounters as through objective and rational thought processes. So what if legitimation of increasingly diverse quantitative and qualitative approaches is actually grounded in multiple theoretical perspectives, well argued across a rapid evolution of ideas in social and educational research? I have attempted over a number of years to revamp this original heuristic, I call it, of Lather and St. Pierre in such a way that it can account for the increase in complexity. And that can be illustrated very easily by looking at the change in the last 15 or 20 years. We're not seeing any. Oh, okay, sorry. So this heuristic, I think, more closely represents the complexity that we're dealing with today. What I think you will see and hear from the panel members today is representative of the diversity in conceptualization, contextualization, representation, and legitimation of social and educational research. That's why these people are here. This group may help you see what journal editors are increasingly facing across diverse manuscripts, and how we make decisions is becoming more and more challenging. So what if we were to refocus the challenge on challenging the ideas and not the people. EE's original mandate. We are here in Madison, home of Aldo Leopold, whose student was Clay Schoenfeld, the original editor of JEE, who recognized Leopold as a great quarterback who was not afraid to change the game plan. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. I'm the next speaker, Bonnie Shapiro from Werklund School of Education. I have been engaging in educational and environmental research for many years. I have been a teacher in qualitative and interpretive research courses and designer of graduate certificate in environmental education, a journal editor, a proposal reviewer, reviewer of tenure and promotion committees. In this short time, I would like to speak about two aspects of border crossings as a foundation for considering quality in environmental education. New ways of engaging research are helping us cross traditional borders, reconfigure those boundaries, blur boundaries that define educational research, and influence what we are determining as important work or what should or should not be published or worthy of funding. I'd like to do this, number one, by sharing a few examples from some of my own interpretive research where border crossings have occurred as I conducted the research, and I believe changed and deepened the quality of the work. These are examples from personal construct theory work, semiotic interpretive work, studies if I have time, and Photovoice. And secondly, I'd like to share some of the ways that ideas about how the quality of research judgment is being transformed and shaped by newly emerging criteria that are not only served to rate research quality for the purpose of granting an award or determining whether an article will be published, but are being presented in ways that actually provide significant guidance and support to help researchers consider ideas about why we conduct research, who it is for, how to plan for it to be more impactful. In Canadian federally funded research programs, a component of a research grant previously referred to as the dissemination plan is currently renamed the knowledge mobilization plan. This renaming transforms traditional ideas about evaluation criteria that are used as, say, a checklist to determine whether a researcher will receive a grant or not. And from my reading of this, it actually converts the process into more of a conversation with possibilities for the researcher about what might be possible for the work, with examples to illustrate right in the application what might be involved and how audiences and venues for reporting findings could be reconceptualized and expanded. So the research. Some of my early research in science education looked at children's conceptions of light. And there had been some research in the field about learners' ideas, but nothing about learners' ideas in action. And so I wanted to look at learners' actual work in classrooms. I video recorded learning sessions focusing on individual students and then invited them to look at these recordings and tell me what was happening for them in that learning situation or the other. There's been some interesting literature and discussion on whether that remembering is an actual remembering of what happened, or if it is a new event that is being produced. I read this as a very positive new thinking, a way of rethinking what students were learning about in a way that brought in a new richness, a new conception into the work. As I continued with the research, I found that learners were increasingly taking me in different directions. And sometimes I found this very distracting and sometimes disturbing. Until one day, I was actually disturbed into realizing that their disturbing and distracting behavior was actually exactly what I was looking for in the research. It was a kind of border crossing for me, and that I saw that individuals were taking actions of their own to learn, and that this was the elements of which, the features of which were exactly what I was trying to portray. I began to notice that individuals, for example, in the case of Melody, who worked so hard at being a social butterfly, that she was never at the table group that she was working with when I went to interview her. This distracted her teacher to no end. She was never at a desk with her study group, and she was always looking around at what everyone else was doing. And then I realized that because of this way of being in the world, learning in the world, thinking in the world, this, in fact, was the way she was learning about the world and learning in school. She could tell you what every other group had learned. She among all the other students, was so skilled in this that I discovered that this was her way of being in the world, and that it was a gift, and that I and her teacher hadn't noticed it up to that point. In another example of teachers, 26 teachers that I was working with who were studying to become science and environmental educators, had the personal construct. One individual had for marking papers or grading papers, he referred to this as administrivia in the first go-around before he had any methods, instruction, or experience in the classroom. But following experience in the classroom and a methods instruction, he referred to this as real teaching. So I asked him, why did you make this dramatic shift in your thinking, this transformation? These were his own words that I was able to draw on, and his own thinking. Yes, I can see that when I mark papers, when I grade papers, I'm actually having a conversation with students. This transformational learning became a part of the research data, but it transformed to become an instructional tool that I actually used in teacher preparation courses to talk about the kinds of changes that occur when students, teachers are engaging in their work. So we see that conceptions of researchers, participants, the students in the first example were drawing me in to redirecting my research agenda, a kind of border crossing where researchers, participants, participant knowledge, researcher direction and knowledge becomes guided by participants. Participants can become researchers. The research findings change and develop and grow as we engage in the research if we allow that to happen. The research audience changes. The knowledge mobilization plans, where the judging criteria that are offered are now being presented as a form of guidance and thinking. This is probably no better represented than in Photovoice, of participatory photography for shared understanding and meaning-making and social change. Photovoice is a form of participatory action research that guides individuals or members of community, and often those communities who experience life challenges that have never before been acknowledged or defined, and they themselves then define those issues of concern and the importance and what is worth bringing forward to the attention of others. They are guided in this process to become the researchers. The venues change. They engage in this work and present in public galleries, in video, or still in image forums, in galleries with gatherings of a wide range of audiences, communities, societies, researchers, social policy makers, government agencies. Photovoice research crosses boundaries that raise questions such as who should take the major role of researcher? What does it mean to be a participant in research? And why do we engage in research? And wonderfully, Photovoice inspires other forms of participatory research. I find this also the case for the new knowledge mobilization guidelines. We are learning through engaging in the process of actually creating the research application to create new ways to consider and assess the long-term impacts of research on policy development, learning skills enhancements, employment, the creation of new skills and capacities, considerations of how our work enhances the quality of life on Earth, and the ways our work embraces community inclusion and social cohesion. We are crossing boundaries concerning ideas about who stands to benefit from the research we are doing, and in what I'm finding are new, powerfully generous, supportive, and more encouraging ways.
Bonjour, good morning. I'm Greg Lowan-Trudeau, and I'm also from the University of Calgary. I'm not sure if they knew what they were getting into having two of us on the same panel. Before I go further, I'd just like to thank the organizers of the panel and the symposium in general. It's been a few years since I was able to attend, so it's a real pleasure to be back with this wonderful group. I'd also like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of this territory, the Ho-Chunk people, and just acknowledge the beauty of this region. I just have been here for a couple of days and had the chance to walk and run along the lake shores on both sides, and it's a very beautiful area, as many of you know, and certainly reminds me of the many years I spent just north of here in Anishinaabe territory on the northern side of the border, the medicine line as we call it. So it's wonderful to be back in this region. I'll just skip ahead here to my slide. So I myself am Métis on both sides of my family. For those of you not familiar with that term, it's similar to the Spanish term mestizo. It means mixed essentially in French. And in Canada it takes on different regional and contextual nuances depending on the person, the family, the community, and the region that you might find yourself. This approach and perspective informs most of the work that I do, and over the past decade or so of being involved in academic work in the specific area of Indigenous environmental education research, and most recently in relation to activism and contemporary critical issues. Certainly a lens that I bring to everything I do. Today I wanted to talk about how some of these different aspects relate to one another. So specifically the relationships between research ethics, place, and the dynamic political and institutional tensions that many of us experience in our different contexts. So as many of you may have also experienced, I've noticed over the past decade or so, and as others have alluded to, as Paul mentioned, I'm certainly looking even beyond that as well, a shift and a growth in the conversation around research ethics in our institutions. I always think, as an example, when I was a graduate student at two different institutions in Canada, I was required to anonymize all of my participants, even though I had requested that they could have that choice. And as a graduate student, of course, you don't have as much advocacy, but certainly in Indigenous context, this was troubling for me at times because, as with Western academic-style research, where we reference and cite people, in Indigenous context, elders and knowledge holders often wish to be acknowledged in a similar way orally. But fortunately, that conversation has quite literally shifted, and now at my current institution and over my past several projects, both there and elsewhere, I've been able to offer that choice to participants, and many, as I'll talk about as I go through a little bit here, take it up in different ways. And so, of course, most of us work with university research ethics boards, and many also with school board research ethics boards, especially in big jurisdictions. I know as a parent of a school-aged child, I really appreciate the work that those boards do also to protect our children and our colleagues working in schools, and also recognize the complexities when these different boards start to interact with one another. In Canada, and I know elsewhere, there's been also a real growth in Indigenous community research ethics boards. So, for example, if you want to conduct research with a particular community or region, now there's often a research board that will vet your application, and you may have to do a presentation, that sort of thing, whether you're Indigenous or not. Also, in Canada, we have different governmental regulations. So in the Northern Territories, specifically the Northwest Territories and Nunavut, that I'm aware of, you have to make a territorial application to conduct research. And again, a higher population of Indigenous folks in those regions. And so, for example, some of the graduate students with whom I currently work are having to submit applications to, looking at this list, maybe 2 or 3 or even 4 different boards to conduct their research. And all for very good reason, though. And it really creates a nuanced understanding of their work. We also have a federal document now, it's in its second iteration in Canada, called the TCPS-2, because it's a second iteration, which guides our research generally. And one of the developments in TCPS-2 is Chapter 9, and Chapter 9 specifically deals with research with Indigenous folks. And of course, as with any policy document, it's not perfect, but it's given us a real base point to start discussions with our various research boards in terms of things like, how do I engage with communities? How do I decide if I can speak with individuals freely, or if this is community-based knowledge that needs a community approval of some kind, and that sort of thing. So it's a complex context, as many of you most likely experience. I just wanted to speak a little more specifically today about the relationship of anonymity and how that relates to our representations of the people and the places that we explore in our research. And I would also acknowledge the recent work of our colleagues Eve Tuck and Marcia McKenzie, I think is here, who've recently done some really insightful work in this area. So as I mentioned, for me, participant choice is always very important, and it's something that I always want to extend to my participants. Like I said, some choose to remain anonymous and use pseudonyms, others use a first name. I'm not sure that I've used full names yet in any of my work, but that certainly does exist, of course. And there are really good reasons why people might choose to be anonymous. I know myself, I'm approached to be a participant in studies on a fairly regular basis, and it always gives me pause to consider these kinds of things. Of course, it's not just individual choice. Sometimes our own anonymity is protecting that of others, as, for example, in school boards and things like that. Others that might not have a say in the work we're doing or the institution. And, also then important to recognize how that might affect our representation of not only the person, but also the place or the context, which of course is an important preoccupation that we have in environmental education research. So just important to acknowledge that. And again, those influences of the various levels of community and culture and institutional, regional, governmental aspects always reminds me of, in Canada recently, you might have heard, we've had some pretty big shifts at the political level. So federally, we moved from a decade of conservative government into arguably more centrist liberal government, and that has shifted conversations to a certain extent, certainly in Indigenous communities and elsewhere. Also in my home province of Alberta, where we're both based, we've had a big shift, arguably larger after 40 years of conservative rule. We had a socially democratic government move in. And again, it's changed the tenor of our conversations in all sorts of ways. And I've noticed personally and also in conversations with others how this influences our work as researchers, and maybe the willingness of people to speak publicly on the record or off the record, anonymize themselves or otherwise in our work. And it leads me just to the final thing I want to speak about, which is how we then go about navigating these nuances and these tensions and complexities in representing our participants in as rich a possible way, while still respecting the various personal requests for anonymity and privacy, and also the institutional and community and regional aspects that all of us encounter in different ways. So of course, as many people do, my work is primarily interpretive and narrative in nature, I would say, and I do use approaches like portraiture that Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot has discussed at length to try to create that thick description and that detailed understanding through words of our participants and their places, even if we use general regional terms such as Central Canada rather than Ontario, or maybe a cultural, traditional, territorial descriptor if possible, or maybe not. So trying to find those ways to still be descriptive. And one thing that I did in my most recent project, which explores the experiences of Indigenous and non-Indigenous educators with taking up complex and current Indigenous environmental conflicts and issues in Canada in their teaching, is I wanted to invite them to provide visual imagery that represented their perspectives and experiences in relation to the project. And it's something I'd wanted to do for years. Many of you, I know, do this probably in more complex ways, but for me it was new. And so here's just one example of one image that a participant recently contributed, and he chose to go by his first name. So just to close, I just have some questions that, again, would pose to the group. So generally, how important is accuracy of place to quality in environmental education research? And what are your own experiences with managing anonymity, place, political tensions, and ethics in your research? What challenges have you encountered, and what are some of the strategies that you've used successfully or that you might envision that you or others could use moving forward in our work? So, Willalin, merci. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here today. My name is Teresa. I'm an assistant professor at Cal Poly Pomona in Southern California, which is one of the 23 CSU campuses. I believe we're actually the largest university system in the United States, and I just realized I think that I'm the only American United States-born person on the panel. Oh, you are, that's right, but you live in Canada. Okay. So I research human-animal relationships, and I'm going to go ahead and talk to you about that today. So we have almost officially entered the Anthropocene epoch. At least that is what 30 of 35 scientists who comprise the Anthropocene Working Group decided late August in an official report to the Geological Congress. I use the phrase almost official here because they are still sorting out which global signals are most significant and when the epoch really began. But as everyone in this room already knows, the stability of the Holocene is gone. While initially a proposed scientific term and concept, the Anthropocene has now morphed, depending on the theorist, into a metaphor, a paradigm, or even a human supremacy complex that continues to emblazon the headlines of popular and scholarly news articles alike. According to some of its proponents, the concept obligates humans to take on a stewardship role, embracing a nature designed by and thoroughly imbricated with us. Others, in contrast, caution that the Anthropocene simply enables a sort of reenactment of Enlightenment grandeur, elevating a monolithic human above a monolithic human-made nature. The culture-nature hierarchy that the Anthropocene concept either challenges or reifies, as theorists proffer and debate various meanings of the epoch, is one of the vestiges of Greek and later Enlightenment thinkers who fashioned man in opposition to other, with the other in this context defined primarily by a lack of human language. As geographer Henry Bowler explains, philosophers solidified this separation as language became, excuse me for all the French speakers in this room, I'm not French, became raison d'etre for entry into social scientific accounts of action in life, giving up the non-human, or what David Abram has coined and what Paul referred to earlier, the more than human, to the natural sciences and their, quote, distinctive mechanistic and observational methods. The animal or more than human turn in the humanities and social sciences has challenged the separation of nature, especially regarding animals, and culture in the field of environmental education and also early childhood studies through a burgeoning body of scholarship informed by critical animal studies, ecofeminism, ecopedagogy, humane education, new material feminism, posthumanism, and post-structuralism, raising an infinite number of questions about what quality means in environmental education research, particularly when engaging the more than human. Although new conceptual theoretical frames, such as the posts, and these include actor network theory, complexity theory, new materialism, posthumanism, vital materialism, and then feminist renditions of each of the above, are taking environmental education in exciting new directions in an attempt to decenter the human through engagement with novel methods, methodologies, epistemologies, ontologies, and even onto epistemologies. I would like to address the point animal geographer Chris Philo made nearly 2 decades ago about the reductionist ways we include animals in our research accounts. So while a geographer and not educationist, Philo and his contemporaries in animal geography, along with ecofeminist thinkers and critical pedagogues, inspired some environmental education and early childhood studies scholars to critically take up the animal question. In a foundational conceptual piece, my colleague and friend Connie Russell critiqued post-post approaches in education and pointed out that scholars frequently write of problematic forms of oppression, such as racism, homophobia, ageism, but that speciesisms are rarely, if ever, named, and instead relegated to the category of, quote, and so forth, after other kinds of injustices are specifically addressed. Although various humanities and social science disciplines have been asking and answering questions about multi-species relationships to a much greater degree than educational studies, the vast body of this work, as Buller emphasizes, has aimed, quote, to come up with some emergent knowing of non-humans, their meaning both materially and semiotically, their impact on or even co-production of our own practices and spaces, and our practical and ethical interaction with and/or relationships to them. While knowledge about how animals co-produce and shape our lives through relational becomings, evolving subjectivities, affects, and even rhizomatic wanderings is critically important and offers our field exciting new theoretical tools to examine what counts as quality research, I want to seize the moment to echo Buller, Philo, and Russell by proposing that we develop methodologies, quote, that suggest or reveal what matters or what might matter to animals as subjective selves. So this is an image of a lorikeet tightly gripping the wire mesh that prevents her or him, since lorikeets are not sexually dimorphic, from escaping the lorikeet forest exhibit at the Aquarium of the Pacific, an informal learning center in Long Beach, California, where I conducted a 14-month multi-species ethnographic study. As long as individual lorikeets are deemed fit for display, they live in a 3,200 square foot outdoor aviary and interact at some level, whether they like it or not, with human interlocutors throughout the day. The institution, it turns out, relies on lorikeet nectar sales for vital revenue, which means that the lorikeets on display in turn rely on human visitors for their sustenance, as the lorikeets keepers only give them their heavier smoothie meal in the evening when the exhibit has closed down. As visitors enter the forest, I'll show you this next. As visitors enter the forest, they typically hold out these $3 plastic cups of nectar purchased from the bar, that's the bar, so that they look like ice cream cones in their hands. Famished birds typically flock to them to sip up the treat. Lorikeets, as ethological studies and anthrozoological studies have taught us, do not typically desire to interact with humans, and signage all over the exhibit warns visitors that lorikeets might bite and that they should not try to hold or pet the birds. Unbeknownst to visitors, however, since they receive some but not all of the facts about lorikeet life, human trespassing into the forest with food can disrupt established lorikeet territories, as famished birds break the rules to cross into their exhibit's mates' spaces to eat. The lorikeets, who are known to fiercely defend their territories, sometimes fight and cause each other serious injury as a result. In this brief talk, I do not intend to critique zoos and aquariums per se, nor the people who work in or visit these places. Rather, I ask what I consider to be critically important questions about the connections between research quality and the representation of more than human others, especially animals. Here's another sign. Had some of the more anthropocentric and humanist research frames in our field guided my research, many of which privilege human action, cognition, discourse, experience, and or meaning making, I would have missed out on the opportunity to capture lorikeet lived experience, to understand how they shape the learning process as much as humans, and to explore how the lorikeets and one of their keepers, Jenny, developed affective and emotional relationships that on some levels challenged the problematic neoliberal ideologies of the institution. I recognize that questions about representation are quite fraught, partially because our own communicative capacities, human language, preclude us from directly inquiring about and even fully understanding what matters to animals. These challenges, as ecofeminist philosopher Josephine Donovan emphasizes, ought not prevent us from developing new theories, methodologies, and methods that radically and systematically consider how we can both make animals matter and reveal what matters to them. Therefore, as environmental education moves to engage new frames of thinking, many of which Paul alluded to on his slide, and which are embedded in the Anthropocene's call to radically dismantle human nature hierarchies, it is critical to ask the following. If we decenter the human, which a panoply of new theoretical frames calls on us to do, by acknowledging that matter is vital in acts, yet ignore that animals have never been made to matter in the way that privileged groups of humans have, do we miss a pivotal opportunity to address and redress species injustices in education and beyond? How do we work with these new paradigms and avoid simply replicating the same modes of anthropocentric thought that have plagued educational studies and even some strands of environmental education, relegating the animal to the category of, quote, and so forth? So as I conclude, I'm just going to ask some questions about animal representation. So how do we take languages that are strange to us, for example, animal ones, and adequately represent them and their speakers? Corman and Vanderkova highlight, for example, that high-quality feminist research does not call on men to speak for women about their experiences, but instead relies on the many voices of, and I emphasize diverse women here, themselves, while new material feminists, in contrast, write of voices in agentic assemblages, where voice is an agent in an assemblage of bodies, mores, objects, communities, etc., instead of belonging to a particular monolithic humanist subject. Since animals cannot communicate with us in languages we understand well, we speak for them, we write for them, making many assumptions about what we know about their lived experiences, and that's if we even consider them as subjects in our research projects. However, I want to ask, what kinds of quality issues does animal representation raise? Is representation even a desirable task? How are quality and representation connected? And most importantly, what kinds of theories and frameworks compel us to even consider these kinds of questions in the first place? So, thank you, everybody.
Okay, lucky last, take a deep breath. The mood that I'd like to create is to step back a little bit and to walk the talk. I could talk for many hours about the latest theory that's been mentioned, but my intention here is not to talk about that, but to actually walk the talk, or how do we ground a lot of theory in the question of research practice. There's many concepts in the range of theories that have been mentioned that I could add to but won't. One of those is the concept of access, and this is where I want to step back a little bit from the idea of quality and all the methodologies and methods that are coming through. I want to step back into, when we're doing research, what's the hard research problem or research questions, possibly hypotheses, that we actually think very seriously about before we start on the research process. So I'll come back to that a little bit later, but in terms of the mood and stepping back that I'd like to create, there's 6 general things that I'd comment on beyond the normal criteria given in reviews of articles or books or chapters or whatever it might be. And hopefully these slides will be appearing later somewhere if they're not already up, but I think it's crucial, and I've been reviewing and I've been a journal editor and all those sorts of things for a long time. Be a historian of environmental education and environmental education research. Everyone in here. Study it. Understand it carefully. Locate whatever your research problem and questions are, at least in the history of the field, as well as others. So what's the rationale and significance of the research that you're undertaking or proposing, or writing a grant for, or writing an article? Second, what's in it for nature? What's in it for nature? Third, read widely, read deeply. I can't stress enough how important it is when you're at the end of your career that you keep reading. It's an incredibly exciting theoretical time at the moment that has major implications for how we conceptualise research, the problems and methodology. The more that you can read, the better. Inter, cross, transdisciplinary understandings. We promised it back in the 70s. Have we delivered? So, another observation, I guess, without going into the jargon that's on the slide there, is that in any research that you're doing, be ultra clear on what the limitations of the research are and the limits of the study. There's so many articles coming through now that don't even acknowledge that. So that's 6 present absences that try and keep this a little bit practical in terms of what you can walk out with. Okay. Access. I could talk a lot about it, but won't. I'll ground this in a PhD study that I'm supervising at the moment. In a nutshell, what access means is what is the reality or realities that we're actually delving into? How well do we understand what it is in which we see a research problem or a research question or potentially a hypothesis as well for those that come out of a different paradigm of research? So, how sharp and precise is your statement of the problem? How do you break that down into a series of research questions that once you work through them in different ways can be re-aggregated back into a real-world problem that you're trying to investigate, understand and maybe change? So, walking the talk. This is a PhD that's just about to be submitted for examination. And woofing is a particular ecotourism type phenomena, willing workers on organic farms or worldwide organic farming. And after much deliberation and reference to some of the theory coming out of eco-phenomenology, which hasn't been mentioned so far in the listing, it's a key informant of how we conceptualise both the problem, the questions and the methods. So you can read those. This student undertook approximately 70 days and nights of field research, combining ethnographic and phenomenological orientations over 4 different sites, or what I now refer to as scapes, with a sample size of 10. 3 research questions that break down the research problem and this particular thesis, and I think this is the crux of what I want to say when we start to talk about multiple realities. And again, I see that a little bit different. I see it as layers in layers of realities. In this particular study, and this is a strong encouragement that I would make in terms of the reading that I'm encouraging, I think it's timely that we start thinking about meta-methodology. In other words, how we can assemble different authors, different methods, different methodologies within the meta-methodology. So I'll briefly refer to James' meta-methodology of constitutive abstraction. Let's just leave that alone for the moment. Noting that in this thesis there are 4 findings chapters that deal with each one of the problem and the 3 questions. But in James' meta-methodology, he talks about empirical analysis, conjunctural analysis, integrational analysis and categorical analysis. And that's 4 layers of reality that have been abstracted epistemologically. But the crucial thing here with regard to Paul's brief is that each one of those layers can employ a different method or procedure in terms of the data collection. Then the art of the research is to deal with that at each level, and then find a way to re-aggregate those 4 levels of epistemological abstraction via this meta-methodology that speaks to the complexity, diversity of the phenomena. Okay, 1 minute left, so as I've said, I want to actually ground this, and I'm going to briefly describe this image because the group that I will work with shortly, we're going to look at that and work out what are the research problems and research questions. Yes, it would be great to go to Lima, Peru, but given that I've only got 30 seconds left, we're not in a time warp here, so a picture will have to do. Let me briefly describe it. This is Lima in Peru, built, I don't know why the Spanish built this city of now about 10 million people on the driest desert in the world, but there it is. This is a shanty town, and you'll notice that there's a wall there, and this is why I've called it the Green Wall of Lima, Peru. If your eyes are good, you'll notice, there's one green plant there, and there's another one up in the shanty town up there. There's a wall, and on the right-hand side of that wall, it's a private school. And you'll see up the top there the statue of Mary Magdalena, Roman Catholic country. Mary Magdalena is facing down the hill to the school. Her back is to the poverty shanty town. No electricity, no sanitation, no water. They have to carry it up 850 steps, I counted, to actually bring in food and stuff into this shanty town. So that sort of whets the appetite a little bit for a group of us to actually sit down and say, how do we work out what the question of access, what realities or layers in layers, whether it be this or the research projects we're involved in, how do we get into it? How do we access it? So we'll start work on that in a minute.
Well, first off, thank you again to our panel chair and our panelists. Let's hear it for them again. So, as you can see, there's lots of different opportunities available to us, lots of ways of thinking about research questions, lots of ways of thinking about the interactions that we have with our constituents, animal and human out there. So what we'd like to do now is in the next 25 minutes, which we have, at your tables, think about which of these 4 questions from each of our panelists, the first being from Bonnie, the second being from Greg, the third being from Teresa, and the fourth being from Phillip. How are we going to address these questions? And elect someone at your table to take some notes on your big piece of paper. Please write your question up at the top. And let's see what comes out of those conversations. We will continue these conversations through a living document that will be at the end, out by the posters, that you'll be able to add to so you can see what are those conversations and key points that came out of each of those discussions. So don't feel like you're going to miss out on the conversations if you choose one question over the other. So I feel like at this point in time, with the increased competitiveness for research grants, so as an example, at my organization, which is the Maine Math and Science Alliance, 80% of our funding right now, we're a $2 million organization, comes from the National Science Foundation. And so, just knowing that we are being pushed by our funders and many different funders around the space to think about research in different ways, but yet also being able to respond to the needs and concerns that were expressed today and are expressed by the communities, individuals, and constituents that we work with is a very difficult task ahead of us. So as we kind of challenge each other and think about how to address these questions and how we're going to push each other to address these questions, boundaries, and barriers in our work, I am really looking forward to see what you all come up with. So again, if anyone has questions for the panelists, please just raise your hands and we'll come around and gather them now. But have fun for the next 20 minutes, and I will wrap you all up when it is time for our poster session. So have some great conversations, make sure you capture those themes, and we'll keep it going later. Thank you again, everyone.